Hello, everyone. Welcome to Now That's Debatable. I am your host, Fantastic Facade, and with me, as usual, is Geocentric Skeptic. Geo, are you with me? Can you hear me?
How about you? Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah. I'm going to go ahead and get
Perfect.
our discussion points up on the page, and then I'm going to try to do an audio test and see if they can hear us in the stream.
Perfect. Uh, did you want me to say anything while you test?
Well, that's okay. You said something, and it was delayed enough that I got to hear that both of us are audible in the stream. So, now that
Perfect.
our live page discussion points are up, and if there are any others that anyone would like to add, of course, you're more than welcome to either chat in or give us a call. Our number is live and currently being monitored. That number is 202-888-5350. And of course, we read all of our chats live there on the screen. If you'd like to say hello or have questions, comments, concerns, like to give your 2 cents, feel free to do so. This week, we're going to be discussing transgender in sports, and we're kind of try to stay specifically to the topic of transgender in sports. We're not taking on the concept of transgender people. And just a disclaimer right off the bat, if you're watching, there's no intent to offend anyone with this video via our language or our words, although Gio and I will both strive to do our best to get the preferred pronouns and language of anyone that would prefer today to be what we would call politically correct, I guess. We basically don't want to intentionally offend. That's not our goal or our purpose. So if we slip up, we do apologize in advance. But our goal is to maintain and use the terms appropriate and preferred by transgender people. So we may use the words transgender or intersex. I will also use the pronouns they. Probably, or we'll try to. We may slip up. But with that in mind, there's no mal intent with anything that we say here. Our goal literally is discussion and debate, and it's just to bring edification to ourselves and others that are watching, and kind of expand our own viewpoints on it, and hopefully expand those that watch and listen. So, Gio, where would you like to start?
Let's start with the elephant in the room, Leah
Okay.
Thomas.
Yeah, so
The
you saw I put Leah Thomas, Castor Semenya, and Fallon Fox up there just because they're kind of breaking stories in transgender sports. So let's start with Leah Thomas.
yeah, so Leah Thomas, she's a swimmer for the University of Pennsylvania, and just this past weekend, she had won a swimming competition. I think it was the
I
was
think it
it
was
the
the 500
500
meter
yard
500
freestyle
meter
or something like that?
meter. We're Imperial, or
Oh,
the Olympics.
meter.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So
Apologize to
my
everyone that may watch it in another country other than the United States. We're the only ones that use it.
yeah. Well, anyway, so like, I mean, when I first saw it, and I saw, um, when I found out her history and that she had one, I was like, oh boy, this is going to be a mess. And so my main concern is that I don't want this to be looked at in a flippant manner. For I see a lot of people, they're immediately dismissing her, her historic win, as they're like, you hear sentiments like, oh, she won because she's a guy. You hear people say, things like that, and I'm just trying to explain what I hear. That's not uh, an opinion that I hold, but unfortunately, she's put in a situation because of her history, being transgender. Any success that she has as an athlete is going to be automatically dismissed by roughly half the population, maybe more so. And I think that's unfortunate. I see some memes being shared about her. They'll say stuff like, I think it'll say that she was ranked 455th as a male athlete, and then she only changed just so she could be competitive. And then as a female, she's ranked number one.
Yeah, and
I don't know. Have you
I've
seen
seen,
that?
yeah, I've seen similar arguments, and I've seen, I think, essentially arguments from ignorance, and especially when making the case that someone is willing to undergo hormone therapy and or body reconstruction or body construction surgeries and things along these lines, just so they can potentially identify as another sex in athletics. To me, that seems like a almost ludicrous argument. I don't think that's ever going to be the case unless you can start taking magic pills to instantly, you know, uh, change these biological factors. And even then, I don't know that that's going to be the situation.
Yeah.
It's just
So
silly.
one thing I wanted to clear up with Leah Thomas. So just to, I don't know a little about her, and I'm not even sure why I feel the urge to defend her. But just to throw this out there, so like she wasn't ranked in like 455th place, not initially. Well, from what I read about her, it's like she was ranked number six initially when she was first swimming at the collegiate level. And then she started undergoing, when she came out as trans, she started undergoing the hormone therapy. And due to NCAA regulations, she had to still compete in the men's division for a certain period of time. But while she was undergoing those hormone therapy, her performance started going down, comparable to about like a female's pace. And then she transitioned. So she was a elite male swimmer, and then she became an elite female swimmer. So just to, cause I want to be make it like very clear that the claim that she only transitioned so she could be a competitive swimmer, it's just it's just false. The evidence just does not show that.
Yeah, and I don't know particularly a lot about Leah Thomas either, but I did look into, there was an open statement and a couple articles going around about a former Olympic athlete that was
Hmm.
not able to make certain. Uh, they were having their last swim meet and they lost out. I think they came in ninth, or they came in like 10th or 11th, and there was only 10 spots open. And Leah Thomas actually came in like fifth place. And so their argument was if Leah Thomas was not perf- competing, then they would have made their spot. And I mean, that's kind of an argument in
Yeah, I
hindsight.
mean that.
That's
Yeah, I mean, sure, that's true. I mean, you could
and like
also say whoever
yeah, I
made the
mean like
second spot, she wasn't competing.
yeah. So I
You
mean
know.
like it's a really poor argument to make, I think, and I think by doing that, it just kind of shows the ignorance, at least to the extent of what is actually being argued. No, I'm not saying there's
Hmm.
not arguments to be made on one side or the other, and we're obviously going to dive into those. That's the whole point of the show.
Yeah.
However, making the argument that, oh, if this one person wasn't in front of me, then I would have made it into the next round. Well, what about the other nine people? Should they also not have been able to compete? Because
Yeah.
like Leah Thomas didn't even come in first place during that event. So it doesn't make any sense to say, oh, if this person wasn't there, like, well, yeah. So if the other nine people had gotten sick or in a car crash, yeah, I mean, you would have made it too. But
Right.
that's not the case.
Yeah.
Like, these
If it
arguments are
wasn't
kind of
for the
silly.
if it wasn't for the Rams, the Bengals would have won the Super Bowl.
Yeah,
You know.
exactly. Like so, I think that
Yeah.
obviously, like there's that case. There's the case of Fallon Fox, which we'll probably talk about a little bit when we come to advantage and fairness. And
Yeah.
there's I don't want to pronounce her name wrong, but I think it's Castor Semenya. Um,
Hmm.
and we'll talk about that and obviously why that made news probably as well.
Yeah.
But while we're kind of talking about it, I think we can. That kind of leads us into the goal of the sporting event. Like, what's the whole purpose of sports in general? Like, what's the reason they exist? And I think you gave, when we were talking about this kind of in preparation for the show, I think your very simple, broken down answer is the best thing that you can strive for. And if that's not what we're competing for, then perhaps we should do something else. But you want to tell them, or should I just use your
Yeah, I'll
own
tell
words?
them.
I'll
Yeah,
credit it to you.
yeah, yeah. So also, like, I mean, at the professional level, like, what you want is meaningful competition, and
Yeah, and
like,
I agree.
emphasis on that meaningful.
Yeah, so I mean,
And
like across the board, I don't I know for a fact that at least the two co-hosts of this show have never played sports at a professional level. Now that I mean, both of us have played sports throughout our time, and I know that both of us have played basketball. I know that I've
yeah,
played my own sports, whatever. But even at the like the non-professional level, meaningful competition is what drives sports forward.
yeah, yeah.
Now,
Because I
at
mean,
the professional
otherwise,
level,
like,
there
you
should be
have, for
additional
instance, like the
rules.
NBA, you have salary caps. Otherwise,
Yeah,
the our wealthy team like the NBA, the Los Angeles Lakers, could just buy all the best players and
yeah. I
just
mean,
win
like if you have a
championship every
wealthy
year.
enough team, you could literally buy every player, and then there would be no
Well,
other
yeah,
teams to compete. You
yeah,
know?
yeah. I mean, and so that's the rosters. I mean, the Lakers could probably do something like that. Just get all
Yeah.
the best
So
players, and
so
so
the point
yeah,
is, like, obviously you want meaningful competition across the board, but within
yeah,
obviously professional sports, there are additional rules and regulations that you're going to have because things like millions or billions of dollars are at their disposal.
yeah. And so and that's why. So in order to promote meaningful competition, the what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to draw these dividing lines, and sometimes it may make sense to draw that line at biological sex. Sometimes it doesn't. And I had said meaningful competition for professional sports, but it's not just that as well. Like, even for children, my nieces and nephew, they all play t-ball, and it's a big thing for them. They really enjoy it, and the boys and girls, they all play together, mainly because there's really no biological advantages that a boy would have over a girl, not before puberty. So that's why you wouldn't divide it along biological sex, right? It would start to make sense to it makes more sense to divide it along the lines of age, right? So if you have like 3 and 4 year old boys playing t-ball against 5, 6, and 7 year old girls, the girls are gonna sweep the floor with them,
Yeah.
just because they're that much more developed. So it and that's what I wanted to that's kind of like what I wanted to focus on, just promoting um that meaningful competition.
Yeah, and just to kind of further pound out this idea, just so everyone kind of understands what I think you mean and what I would mean when I say meaningful competition in sports, is that let's say you have, and no offense because an indoor person. I like my inside. I don't go outside very often, right? But let's say there's a mountain climbing competition that's happening, and all the people that have competed in the past 10 mountain climbing competitions come to my home state to climb mountains. Okay. Now you have a whole bunch of athletes out here that are ready to climb mountains, and the person that gets to the top wins. Like the person who gets to the top fastest wins, right? And then I decide I want to go out there and climb a mountain, which I've never done before, right? There's really no competition between me and the athletes that have trained and climbed mountains for their whole lives, or for a significant part of their lives, and they've trained to climb mountains. So they're not going to look at me like competition because I don't climb mountains. Right? So when we're talking about meaningful competition in sports, when it comes to transgender, if you have a situation in which you would never put a person in professional sports who's never picked up a basketball on a team, on a professional basketball team, no matter whether they were transgender or not, it doesn't matter. Like, it just doesn't make any sense, right? So you want this competition because that is what not only the viewer, but it is also what the contenders want in sporting events to help push them forward. I think it's really, really, it's, I can tell you where it came from, but it's not really relevant. I think a really good saying that comes to sports is that you're the best thing that can happen to you in sports is that you find a really good rival, because that tends to push you further than you can ever push yourself. And when you have that rival, it's someone that's typically just slightly better than you are. Because if you're crushing your opponent in every game, you're not learning anything new. And if your opponent's crushing you in every game, you're not learning anything new. And neither are they. Right? So what you want is a balance of not getting crushed and not crushing your opponent. That head to head that often comes down to like buzzer beaters in basketball, or like the final out, or a triple,
Yeah.
a triple play that came out of nowhere in baseball or whatever. Those are what everybody cheers for. Those are what everybody in the sporting events remembers. That's what those people have trained their entire lives sometimes to get to. It's those that are like, wow. It's the ones that are like blowouts that like, I'm not going to watch this junk.
Yeah, so like a lot of organizations, they're trying to best their they're trying their best to promote that, and I think that's really what they're aiming for. What it really comes down to is how do you tailor the rules to best promote that meaningful competition. And so there's a lot of ways where they can get it right, and there are some examples when they get it just dead wrong. I think a perfect example of that is with the was IOC when they implemented the testosterone test. So in track and field, mostly what they look at is testosterone levels, and so it doesn't matter about what type of organ you have between your legs, whether it's the penis or vagina. What matters is their testosterone level. So they're gonna do a blood test and they're gonna see how much testosterone do you have per liter, and they usually get this right because the best part about this is why it's better than the NCAA's rule. Is because with NCAA you only have to go through hormone therapy for a year, but there's no testosterone testing. So what that means is you go through it for a year, you're automatically eligible. But if you're transitioning to a female, you may still have all of those advantages that you had as being a biological male. So the IOC standard was a little more in depth, looking at testosterone. They wanted to make sure, regardless of how long you were undergoing that gene therapy, were the levels low enough to bring to maintain meaningful competition in the female events. And what ended up happening was it ended up disqualifying a biological female.
Okay,
Caster Semenya.
Yep.
Yeah, and so she's unable to compete, and she's just as much of a female as any other biological female you'd meet. She was born a girl, and now she's a woman, and she has naturally high testosterone levels, which promotes a lot of things. For example, hemoglobin in the blood, which helps push oxygen to your muscles, right? Which makes them endure longer. It helps increase muscle mass and gives her that explosive, energy. These are all just natural. There were advantages nonetheless, but there were advantages that existed for her as a biological woman. And I think for most people who are, I guess, trying to maintain, I guess, what they would call the fidelity of the sport, I would say just trying to maintain meaningful competition. This rule actually did the contrary.
Yeah, so I mean, it kind of was we know they got this situation wrong because there shouldn't be any situation in which there's this one single test that can rule out a biologically born female from competing in a female event, right? Like,
Yeah.
so we know Castor Semenya, even though she had higher levels of testosterone than normal, and even though she was willing to like submit to, an affidavit saying she hadn't done like testosterone hormone therapy, etc., she was just biologically born female with higher levels of testosterone than average. Um, it was still exclusive, but that's where I think we have a couple things. We're talking a little bit about the difference in standard among sports organizations, but I think we're primarily talking about advantage versus fairness here, because statistically, there's always going to be advantages to teams, people, whatever in sports, because it's just natural selection at its finest. Some people will be born taller than others. Some people will be born shorter. Some people will be, whatever. There's an infinite
Yeah.
number of things that you would calculate into whatever particular sporting event you're looking at. You can look at some of the best and worst players of sports in history, and that doesn't really tell you too much compared to like biological advantages that someone may have within a particular sport. I think Stan Lee came out with a TV series called Superhumans, or he's just talking about taking down like people with innate or strange abilities, or that just seem to have physical differences that would provide them a physical advantage in certain aspects. And one of the examples given on that show was LeBron James in basketball, because his hand is about 12% larger than the average NBA player's hand, which allows him better ball control and the ability to palm and dunk easier than the average NBA player, which is already the elite upper echelon of basketball in the United States. So when you have these are undoubted advantages to playing the sport of basketball. Probably wouldn't be great advantages in like fitting through small spaces, given that he's well
Yeah,
over 6 foot tall.
that's another thing. Like when we talking about like physical advantages, like they're not necessarily tied to um muscle mass, and hormones in your body. There are things like hand and eye coordination, right? So that's why I was reading in one article that uh, female golfers could be competitive with male golfers. I'm sorry, trans female golfers could be as competitive as your cisgender um, golfers. And so like I think that's another mistake with the testosterone standard. It doesn't dive deep enough to really parse through the nuanced advantages slash disadvantages that transgenderism could bring to the table.
Right, and I think when we
I
talk
think
about like advantages versus fairness, like obviously, like in the case of LeBron James, having a 12% larger hand than the average NBA player is undoubtedly an advantage, but is it such an advantage that it becomes unfair? And like I think part of the question is, A, where do we draw the line, and B,
yeah.
like I think that's where the entire concept and the entire topic of today's show gets muddled, is because it's really hard to kind of come up with a good, perfect solution.
Yeah,
I don't know that there is a perfect solution, but
what it's going to take more studies into the transition process for athletes. Like we have tons and tons of data about the transition process of non-athletes. So I mean, so we can, like, I mean, I can quote to you to like for about 30 minutes or so, like different studies that shows the testosterone levels, how it drops. Like how you can see the difference in testosterone from like the first year to the second year, and etc. Right, but as far as athletes, there there's not a lot of studies, and so and that's the thing, that there's no reason to assume that a professional athlete who's training, day and night, lifting weights, eating right, have like everything accessible to him to give him the peak body. Him, think about like for example, like your LeBron James, like who you were just talking about. There's no reason to think that 1 year of gene therapy, of hormone therapy, would make it fair to put him in a WNBA, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
physically, biologically speaking, LeBron James is an outsider of the
Yeah.
norm. Like, and I don't want to say like I don't want to use the term freak by any means, but I'm sure that's what the term was used on the show.
Yeah.
To use the
Since
term the
yeah.
show used, he was a freak, and what they mean by that is he's literally an outlier of data, because you have the
Yeah.
upper echelon of athletes already that you're comparing him against, and in the case of LeBron James, he still had physical biological advantages to the best players in the world.
Yeah, and so and I mean it gets even more difficult if you think about, for instance, like if I chose LeBron, he's only like 6'8". Like, what if you did to someone like a Shaquille O'Neal, right? So then now, if you were to put him if through the same gene therapy and throw him in a WNBA, right? Not only there's the strength difference, but like there's a huge height advantage because he's tall for a male. I don't know too many. I don't know if there's any 7-footer WNBA players. So this standards they're using for the hormone therapy, so far it has shown to be wholly inadequate to use for um, the higher level sports organizations, especially at the professional level.
Yeah, and it's not to say
Uh,
that there isn't a solution out there. It's just to say that hormone
yeah, it's new
therapy
to
for
us.
a minimal amount of time doesn't seem to be the solution. It's
Yeah.
not providing adequate results to maintain that meaningful competition that we were talking about earlier. Like, it's just not. It's not, like, especially if you took, like you said, Shaquille O'Neal. He was like 7'1", 7'2", over 300 pounds, and just a monster. The guy was insanely heavy. He was insanely tall. He was insanely strong, and it, 6 months of hormone therapy for Shaquille O'Neal would probably not do anything. Like, it's just
It wouldn't.
like you probably
Even
wouldn't
after
you
a
probably
year,
wouldn't notice a
he'd
difference.
he'd probably still be like competitive in the NBA. You know,
Yeah,
especially we're talking about like Shaq, in his prime. So that's
yeah.
what I was saying. So
22,
like
23 year old Shaquille O'Neal would still be insanely good player.
yeah. Yeah, like these tests that are used on non-athletes, they don't clearly they don't. It's not a smooth transition over to don't translate well for your athletes, especially at the professional level. And the more elite they are, the less it seems to translate. I was reading one study that the army did, and they were comparing the APFT, the Army Physical Fitness Test. And for those of you that don't know, the APFT, it consists of 2 minutes of push-ups, 2 minutes of sit-ups, and then a 2-mile run. And so they were comparing your transgender your trans women with your cis women. And what they found was that for push-ups, there was no advantage between the cis and the trans women. Like they were doing the same. Same with the sit-ups. So at that level, it seems that like their chest and the core muscles didn't seem to change much. With the run, they were still about 12% faster. And one one thing to consider is that in the study, I didn't see where they talked about at what point the transition happened, because as you know, that makes a big difference. If you transition, like usually the earliest that you can start the transition process is the moment you start to hit puberty, right? So it doesn't make a lot of sense to start injecting hormones into like a 7 or 8 year old, nor would it even be wise or ethical. So like they usually start that right at puberty, right? And so that for I- the difference between a transgender woman who started the process right at puberty versus starting it, in the late 20s, well after puberty, well after she's had the full advantage of being a biological male. I'm talking about like the bone density, the muscle mass, all of that stuff, right? There seems to be a pretty big difference. I was reading one study. It said that people who waited after puberty, transgender women who waited after puberty, still retain about 85% of their strength. So that is alarming, right?
Yeah, because I
So
mean, obviously, like you said, with the goal of beating full competition in mind, having such a staggering biological difference and transitioning later seems to be a posing problem for competitive sports.
yeah,
Like because I mean, just at a very basic level, when you have a male, biologically born male versus a biologically born female going through puberty before the transition, then you typically have extremely elevated levels of testosterone versus estrogen, and which you have typically on biologically born males a massive expansion of muscles and bone density. So that's
yeah,
just something that is just comparative to
and
biologically born females. When they go through puberty, typically they actually develop a little more fat, and
mhm.
their sex organs start to develop, and whatnot. So
Yeah, they're going to have a higher
biologically,
BMI. Their hips,
yeah, their hips
that's a huge
widen,
factor when it comes to
their
running.
pelvic bone expands.
Exactly. Like if you notice, like in track and field, like most of your like your they're really most of your competitive sprinters, female sprinters. If you look at their hips, they're kind of narrow. The wide hips that you develop during puberty, it makes you a slower runner. It's a disadvantage mechanically, and that's something that a transgender female, if you waited to after puberty to transition, you're not gonna. That's not gonna apply to you. You're not gonna have that disadvantage
Yeah,
mechanically
and
at the hips.
just to kind of throw in a little bit of a personal tie that I won't mention who, but I'll tell you when we're off air. But you and I both actually know someone, and you may know who it is when I mention it. But when after they went through puberty, they started going to see a doctor, and she was told that her hips weren't wide enough to provide childbirth. Like she would undoubtedly have to go through a cesarean section because she just had such a small frame.
Hey, go ahead, talk. Give me. I gotta step away for 30 seconds.
No
Go ahead.
worries. Yeah. So in that case, and in the situation, it seems that waiting until after puberty would undoubtedly provide an advantage to if hormone therapy and treatment is started during the initial stages of puberty.
All right, I'm sorry, I'm back.
No worries. Um,
Yeah, and also I wanted to say, just think about, it's like I'm not a professional athlete now, right? I mean, but like I'm pretty active, and let's say I were to transition now, right? And so let's say that I was an athlete, right? And I were to go to try to transition now. So that study showed that I'd maintain about 85% of my strength, right?
mhm,
Then that's the figure that I gave. So like right now, I'm I can bench press about 425.
right.
85% of that is 361. That is less than 425, obviously, but it's still way higher than. I mean, I can't think of any female that's benching that much. Not even like in it. I'm not sure what the female record is raw bench, but I mean it's just to show you just the significant strength advantage that not even a professional athlete, but just me. ordinary IT nerd would have as far as strength wise if we were to transition this late in the game. And so that's a
Yeah, and that's what I was saying. So, like, I made the point. I don't know if you heard, but I mentioned that you and I both we have a friend in common that was told after puberty that she would probably have to have, if she ended up getting pregnant, she would have to have C-section
yeah
because her hips didn't develop. But that's something that it that's again an advantage versus necessary unfairness. So obviously, wider hips are something that happens typically to biologically female women as they go through puberty. Not in all cases. I made it the point that we have a friend that did not happen. However, if we look at cases in which biologically born males wait until after puberty, where their muscle mass and bone density increase, um, then what happens is that you start to see where these biological advantages have come into play well before the transition starts.
yeah. And so that's when I looked at not to go back to Leah Thomas again, but I mean, she transitioned pretty late. Like she was already a you know very elite college athlete before she started the transition. But a part of that army study, here's something else that I found was interesting, was that the when he looked at cisgender males versus trans men, the trans men were at an advantage as far as sit-ups. So
Interesting.
that's to me that was interesting.
Yeah.
That you have these women, former women who are transgender men, who are now outperforming men and cisgender men. I'm sorry if, if
Yeah.
I'm
That's why we
if I'm
gave a disclaimer
screwing
at the
up.
beginning. We apologized just to
Yeah,
try to keep on track. I think everyone understands what you're saying, and as we stated at
yeah,
the beginning, we're not doing
yeah.
anything to
There were
intentionally.
trans. Yeah, I'm not doing this on purpose. There was trans men who were they were outperforming cis men
Yeah.
and the sit up category on an APFT. So that brings in the issue because you always hear that this guy he became a trans so he can compete against women, but like um a woman who transitions couldn't ever hope to compete against men, cis men.
Yeah, and
That
I mean, I
that's
think
not that's I was gonna say like did this kind of calls that into question.
yeah,
You know,
not only that, but it also really depends on the competitive sport that you're playing. Which I
yeah.
want to give this really fun fact because I think it's really fun. Do you want to take a stab at why there's a horse in the background of the pictures that are flashing on the screen?
I have no idea.
That horse is there because until the year 2020, in the Olympics, there were the only intersex sport that existed was horseback riding, is equestrianism. So it was the only Olympic sport before the year 2020 in which both biological male, biological female simultaneously were allowed to compete against one another until 2 years ago. Um, the reason I included the horse is because A, that's a really fun fact, but when you start to think about things like horseback riding or things like table tennis or billiards, or there's an infinite number of other sports in which you could name where there is not going to be a severe biological advantage from one player over the other. Now, admittedly, there can be extreme biological advantages, but there are a number of sports and a number of competitions in professional and at least competitive, if not professional sports, in which biology isn't going to give a competitive advantage to one named gender over another. It's just not going to happen. So I wanted to include that because it was the only one. But I thought it was very interesting because they didn't exist. And then I think there were 7 events that were added in the 2020 Tokyo Olympics that were intersex. And they included swimming and table tennis. So.
Okay. Awesome.
But I think that just kind of goes back to, like, obviously, like, even in cases where you have cisgender versus transgender men in the APFT, it's not necessarily just because it's a biological advantage because they're biologically born men. That's just not the case. And there are many sports in which it's irrelevant altogether. So.
Yeah, and I think reducing it to what organ you had between your legs when you were born. I mean, I think that is not you're not coming to the table with the complexity and the skepticism that that this issue deserves.
That we're getting a call. I don't know if you can hear it. Hopefully so.
Oh, okay, I'll bring him in.
Thank you for calling Now That's Debatable. This is your host, Fantastic Facade. Who am I speaking with?
You are speaking with Nico Davis.
Hi, Nico.
Nico, what's going on, brother?
Can you?
There's
hear
there's a delay.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Listen on the phone, not on the podcast.
How you doing?
Yeah, can you hear him through the phone, or are you hearing him through the podcast?
I'm hearing him through the podcast.
Well, through the phone, I can only hear you.
Okay.
When you say hearing him, what are you talking about?
A Geo, or my co-host.
Yeah.
Oh, no, I can only hear you.
Okay, gotcha. If you can hear him through the podcast, there is unfortunately about a 10-second delay. I'm gonna see if I can reroute the audio real quick. But in the meantime, guys can chat it up.
Well, if he can only hear you,
okay.
He can hear you on the podcast, Geo.
Okay. Go ahead. All right. Go ahead, Nico. We were actually talking online earlier today.
You can't hear him in the podcast?
Yeah, well, I'm not connected to the podcast. I'm only connected on the phone here.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. Okay, let's see if I can get his audio routed to you real quick.
Okay.
Yo, hey, Grim, what I'm sorry. Hey, Facade, while you're doing that,
yeah.
Can you get Nico to state this point?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Nico, while we're working on this audio, I hope you can still hear me okay, but we're basically trying to get... what's the purpose of the call? What are we calling it about? You still there? You still there?
Yep, I am here.
Okay, well, while I'm working on this audio, if you could just explain what the purpose of your call was, we'll go ahead and try to tackle that, and we can hear you and go from there.
Ask him his position on just transgender sports.
I am calling in because, I recognize that I have the opportunity to do so from your co-host.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yeah, so I am calling in to kind of see exactly what his position is, and then express my position, and see if we can't discuss it a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, want to know each other's positions. So what is your position on transgender people participating in competitive sporting events? And then we'll let Geo respond to that while you take it on. Geo, can you hear Nico?
I can hear him.
Perfect. Okay, so while you start, and while I work on the audio, we'll let him respond. We'll let Geo respond.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, all right. And hopefully we get that audio working, because whenever he does respond, currently I can't hear him, so...
Yeah, hopefully I get that straightened out real quick.
Okay, fantastic. Well, yeah, I'll go ahead. So to answer that's a multifaceted question. So I think that every human on the planet should have the right to participate in athletics if they so choose. And so that includes if you're transgender, if you're male, female, whatever you identify as, that you're all included in that. Furthermore, there's a dilemma with who participates where. I think that biologically and physiologically, biological males have a distinct and extreme advantage over biological females when it comes to sports. And so if someone is transgender and they transition from male to female, although legally they are considered female and they identify as female, to participate in female sports would be completely unfair because biologically they are male, regardless of what they identify as. And that's kind of my premise there.
So can you still hear us?
Can you hear me, Nico?
I can only hear you. Maybe it's your co-host.
Gio, can you try saying something else? Because I adjusted the audio while we're talking.
Yeah. Okay. Hey, Nico, can you hear me?
Okay,
so there we go. Now can you hear each other?
Yes, indeed.
And you can still hear Nico?
Yes.
Gio?
Yeah, I can. I heard Nico's entire explanation.
He can hear you now.
But I'm not sure if he can. I'm not sure if he can hear. He can hear me.
He can hear you now.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. All right. Perfect. Okay. Good. So, honestly, yeah. I'm sorry. Okay. So
excited, we got it working.
Well, I think earlier online we were talking like specifically like about like Leah Thomas. I understand the issue with her. Like she did the transition much later in the game, right? But what studies are showing that if you transition earlier, like the earliest possibility you can, like legally speaking, which is right when puberty starts, your strength, your testosterone levels, your hemoglobin, all of those levels, they're going to be comparable to what you would see in a female. You know, so the advantages that you pointed out, they shouldn't be there, or at least what the scientific studies are showing, they're not there, depending on when the transition happens. Does that change your mind at all?
Okay. Well, it depends. So, well, first off, I'll address talking specifically about this individual, this swimmer, and what is her name again?
Leah Thomas.
Her name is Leah Thomas now.
Leah Thomas. Okay, so as you pointed out, she transitioned later in life. So being post-pubescent, her body developed in a way that women's bodies in general do not develop. But certain developments in strength and bone density and mass are essentially on a very, now we're always going to be speaking generically, by the way. I just want to put that out there because you can find a woman that is stronger than a male, right? We know that exists.
Sure.
We're talking about women at large and men at large. Just want to clarify. But yeah, so that person is going to have distinct and extreme advantages over women in competitive sports because they have extreme advantages physically. So as far as she is concerned, I think her individual situation is unethical and frankly immoral as well. That's her individually and how she competed and was successful against biological women. Now, regarding what I was going to say, regarding what you said about individuals, essentially children who transition to, and we'll be specific here, we'll say little boys who transition into girls in a prepubescent phase, essentially their bodies and therefore their athletic ability is comparable to a person who was born a woman and just essentially lives their life as a little girl and then eventually a woman. Now, I will say this. If it is proven via, if it's scientifically proven and tested that males who experience a transition, and whatever that entails, so whether that's a hormonal treatment, whether that's whatever is included in a transition, if it is proven scientifically that they have zero advantage due to their biological sex, I am on board with that. But again, it cannot be, they only have a 5% advantage, a 10% advantage.
But I think you created a standard that's like impossible. Like you're saying, like you want them to prove that there is zero, zero biological advantage due to the sex.
There would have to be zero, because
Gio, do you mind if I step in?
Biological advantage among women to woman. There is zero biological advantage based on the fact that they were born a woman. So if an individual who has male genitalia is going to compete against individuals who have female genitalia, you have to prove that under the treatment they underwent, that there is zero advantage due to their biological sex.
So can I step in, Gio? Can I step in real quick? Just
sure, go ahead.
I have a question for Nico for clarification,
sure.
But I want to address what you just said real quick. If we could prove beyond reasonable doubt that there was no competitive advantage provided strictly due to biological sex at birth, would you be okay with all transgender people competing in all sporting events for any reason they would like?
Yes, and I want to be clear about this. So if, for example, this scientific study is conducted in 2025,
right,
and therefore children who are 6, 7, 8 years old in 2025 essentially undergo that transition, I would not be okay with 25 and 30-year-old individuals who previously underwent that transition then as well entering into sports with like, for example, someone who transitioned from male to female entering sports against biological females. I would not be okay with that, because they did indeed have that biological advantage. But
so
from that point forward, if any person who wants to compete makes that transition in their youth, and it is proven that there is zero athletic advantage whatsoever, then I would be completely okay with every single individual who underwent that transition at that age where it would give them zero advantage.
Just to clarify,
so that's standard. That is beyond the epistemic capabilities of science. They couldn't. There's no scientific study that could prove that there are zero advantages due to biological sex. Like the best they can do, I mean, is just show probability. They could take a group of trans women, right, and say, hey, this group they started a transition process right when puberty began, and we looked at their strength and their muscle mass and bone density, and it is roughly equivalent to cisgender women. That is the best that science could do epistemically. It couldn't go any further. It couldn't go any further than that. And that's, from what I've read, that's exactly what's been shown.
And I just want to clarify, because you mentioned earlier, and I liked the choice of wording, so I want to compliment it. You mentioned earlier that you didn't want any biological advantages strictly from the point of sex. And I can agree that if there are biological advantages strictly contested on the point of sex, that obviously is a disadvantage to someone who did not get born the biological gender that they are identifying as. However, when you made the longer contested point, you mentioned that you didn't want any physical advantages. And I think earlier in the show, we talked about how basically, due to nature of the way human body develops, there are going to be physical advantages no matter the gender you're born as in certain cases, because obviously when you look at professional athletes, they're the upper echelon of their fields, right? But there are still
Correct.
outliers to those cases and examples.
Correct.
Yeah, you know what?
We mentioned
I could.
LeBron James, who
I'm sorry,
who has
I cut
like
you
such a large hand span that he has
Yeah.
12% larger hand span than the average NBA player. So when
Certainly.
you're looking at like NBA players, they already are in the best physical condition that of some of the best people in the world, and then you add someone like that who's 6'8" and has a 12% larger hand span than even the best players in the world. That's a physical advantage.
Yes,
Yeah,
it is.
I don't think it was.
Yes, it is. But,
were you talking about that?
but oh, what'd you say?
I just wanted to ensure that.
Were you talking about physical advantages? I thought it was just strictly to biological sex.
Yeah, I just wanted to ensure that's not the case.
Yeah, which he kind of.
I don't think that's what he meant.
At the beginning just now is that I did say at a certain point physical advantages due to sex, but then there was another point where I may not have explicitly said that in that moment. So that's
and I just wanted to clarify. That's all. I know you mentioned it at the beginning, so that's all.
Yeah, that's what I perceived from you. Certainly. So,
back to the standard. Like, do you not see how like that's an impossible standard? Like proving that there is zero advantages because it's not like humans are a monolith. Hold on a second.
Let me clarify. Let me
roughly
respond to what he said and just agree. So I just want to be clear that yes, if I did say physical advantage, I was referring to physical advantage due to the biological sex of the individual.
Yeah, I'm tracking.
You probably don't know. You don't know me, but I was a collegiate and professional athlete myself, and I do understand that very well. And I'm 6'5", 290 pounds, and I look like I'm 225 pounds. Just that's how my physique is built, and so I certainly understand that advantage that I have over other men. Certainly.
Yeah, for y'all that don't know, this guy that's calling in, he played for the Chicago Bears. He's an NFL player, so he's very familiar with this. But back to like my question, like, do you don't understand? Like, do you see like the standard that you set? Like, it sounds like to me like that standard that would permanently bar any trans women from competing.
So
you don't see how that standard does that?
Well, I see that it is an extreme standard. I will agree with you there. However,
how about this?
Wait, let me just say it's an extreme standard, but it's the same exact standard that men are held to when competing against men. That there is no scientific evidence to prove, obviously, because they're all men, you cannot prove that, okay, this guy was born a biological male, person A, and person B was a biological male as well. So how do you even begin to prove that there's an advantage or not? And the answer is there's not an advantage because of sex, because they're the same sex. And now, you might, as you stated earlier on Facebook through our post, I don't know if you discussed that on your podcast already, but there may be advantages with height, with weight, with your ethnicity. You may have a thicker bone density. You may have muscles that develop in a way that other men's muscles don't develop. Now, that's biological, that you cannot change. And so that's not the standard that I set. That is the standard that is requisite if you are going to allow something as extreme and egregious as men competing athletically against women. That is extreme. That is egregious.
But shouldn't the onus be on those trying to prevent trans athletes from entering? Like, I would say
absolutely
that,
not.
Okay, but so what you're saying is you're putting trans women into like this box, and you're saying, hey, unless you can prove beyond all doubt that you don't have any advantage, then you can't compete. Dude, I'd bet you a lot of money that if we were to find out tomorrow that Serena Williams is a trans woman who started her transition process at the beginning of puberty, people would start saying that the only reason she was so dominant was because of the advantages of being a biological male, and there'd be no way that she could prove otherwise.
Why wouldn't Why wouldn't people say that? I mean, would you expect anything else? Or
Well,
let me word it
that's
differently.
well,
Does
that's what I'm
anything
saying. Well,
else
that's
make
the
sense?
problem. It would prevent it would prevent some really good some really good talented trans women from being able to compete, in the appropriate
Okay.
category,
Okay.
just because of people are
This is we
suspicious
need
of her.
to.
And
I think.
you're
Okay.
asking her to prove her innocence. It should be us
What? No. Oh,
trying to
Lord. Hey.
give
Whoa.
reasons to
Whoa.
disqualify her.
I look, man. I don't want to insult you here, but I'm shocked at what you just stated. Now,
Mhm.
you just outlined a situation in which Serena Williams, who we presume to be, and I will use this term, this phrase, who we presume to be woman through and through, that if it
Mhm.
were revealed that she indeed was not a woman through and through, but rather she was a transgender woman who transitioned from a male, you're now saying if that came out, she has to then, or it's unethical or immoral or not right for her to essentially prove her innocence? Sir,
No,
that
I'm
is
talking about early
beyond
stage
preposterous.
transitions. So early stage transitions, and what the studies are showing is that um, trans women who started the transition process right at the beginning of puberty, they're not showing any advantages when it comes to bone density, and muscle mass. So what I'm
Okay.
saying is, if we were to find out that that's the situation that Serena Williams is in, we were looking at this talent, and she's just a dominant female. But
Wait,
instead of
wait.
us attributing this to her talent, people will be attributing this to the fact that that she has, the wrong set of chromosomes. That's what I'm saying, and
So
it would
what
be
I hear what
on
you're
on.
saying, but what I'm saying to you is, so I agree that people would attribute it to her chromosomes, her biological nature, again, under this hypothetical situation, but they would do so appropriately. Because again, you're saying now it is not even close to being scientifically confirmed that children who experience a transition in their youth, prepubescent, that there is zero advantage. That is not proven. It's not even close to being
Yes,
proven
yes,
scientifically.
science. That's
And
that's what I'm saying. Like science can't do that. That is beyond the epistemic capabilities of science. You couldn't prove there is 0% advantage to being bald or 0% advantage to being left-handed. Like that's what I'm saying. That is not in the nature of science. So would you have
okay,
put a wall
would you
between
take
transition?
would you take 99%?
Go ahead. You said say it again.
I said, would you
I,
take
I think
99%?
I think the preferred would just be within the realms of average, because when you start saying things like 99, 95, 100%, etc., you're really testing the limits of, like, let's draw the line in the sand here. And if you just look
Well,
at the statistical averages
yeah.
across the
Okay,
board, like
Father.
if I were to say, like, oh, this
That's what
person.
is required. It's not me trying to. That's what's required. Let's use hair for example. Now we know for a cold hard fact at in excess of 99% provability that the style of someone's hair has no effect on their athletic ability or biological advantage. Now we know that. That can be proven. Same thing with I mean the list goes on. Same thing with whether their body is naturally smooth or naturally hairy, or if or the color of their eyes. Those things are yeah. Science may not be able to
But
prove it at a 100% rate, but if you try to convince me it's anything less than 99.9%, I would say that you are insane for even suggesting so.
oh, but here's the
And
thing.
so
Like epistemically,
that's the
the
requisite.
best that science could do. So the best that science could do, it could compare, like, it could look at cis women and trans women, and we look at their performance, and the best they could do is say, we don't see any advantages. They could not confirm that there are no advantages. That is not what science does. The best they could say is, we don't see an advantage. And from the studies that I've seen, that's exactly what it's showing. It's saying we don't
Okay,
see an
so
advantage. And if you're claiming
well,
there
I'll
is an
see.
advantage, well, then the onus ought to be on you to demonstrate that. Say, here's the study. Look at our numbers. Show us where this advantage is, because we don't see it. Or do your own study and publish it and let us peer review it.
Well, let me
That
say,
is the
I'll
best that it could do.
repeat. Well, I'll repeat what I stated earlier. That if indeed it is scientifically proven that there is, and I'll use, what's a good word? I'll use the term virtually, that there is virtually no advantage between a prepubescent male who makes a full transition to include hormonal treatment and what have you, no advantage to a essentially fully female counterpart. As I stated earlier, I am indeed okay with that. However, we got a couple things going at hand here. First off, we don't have examples of this in the athletic sphere where people have when people have had treatment at that age and it is scientifically proven that there is no advantage, and then they go on to compete in sports and whatever happens because, again, there's no advantage. We don't have an example of this. And these examples that are becoming popular,
I had mentioned that.
like the swimmer,
You're
for
right. I
example,
agree. Like
she's not.
all those studies I'm quoting, they're from non-athletes. So there's like zero research on athletes, especially professional athletes, because there's just not a lot of them. And there's not even
Okay,
enough to
so
even
so we'll have to
do like
agree
a
then.
actual study on it.
So yes, we'll have to agree then. Until that is actually fleshed
But
out in a scientific study, then we cannot, because again, the burden of proof is on the biological males who are trying to compete against biological women, because that is the outlier.
The burden of proof ought to be on the person making the claim. And so,
yes, and the claim
you're
is
claiming that there's a biological difference
I don't have
for this specific category of early transitioning trans women. What I'm saying is, I don't see this advantage. So, like, you're saying there is one. I'm not saying there is or isn't. All I'm saying is I don't see it. So that will put the burden of proof on you. So, unless and argue, shouldn't we go in favor of liberty? Like, until it's proven otherwise.
I just have a really quick question. Nico, can I step in real quick with just a quick question?
Okay, let me hold on a second. First off, since we don't have the examples, as you and I both agreed, let's move on from prepubescent transition, because we don't have those examples. So cool, we kind of agree on that. If it's proven beyond shadow of a doubt, then I'm okay with it. You're clearly okay with it. Cool, let's move on. Now,
well, I don't think that can happen. That was my point. Like, that's an impossible standard. It'd be great if that could happen. What I'm saying is that is beyond the epistemic capabilities of science. It could not prove that.
So then what? What ought to be the standard?
The best we can say is we don't see an advantage. It couldn't prove conclusively there is no advantage. Just like imagine if you had to prove when you were trying out, like, I think I said you played for the Bears. I think you played for the Steelers. Like, imagine if when you were trying out for the NFL, you had to prove that you weren't using steroids, right? So
you do.
Yeah, well, no. What they do is he tests everybody. You're not proving that you're not using steroids, because even a negative test wouldn't prove that. You could be masking it with something. You could be like, there's always room. There's always room to hide it. The test could be wrong. You could have like some super secret covering agent. There's always a way around that. It's on the NFL to prove that you are cheating. That's not on you to prove that you aren't. You're innocent until you're proven guilty. That's what I'm saying. And that's the same. What's the same standard I think we should apply to them.
Can I just step in with a really random question?
So let me
Nico?
I just want to clarify, because I mean this is just. I mean, I'll be honest with you, man. I think this is beyond outlandish. Like, I don't even know how you are able to fix your lips to communicate in this manner regarding what it sounds like to me, and I've experienced people who seem to be the way you are in this regard. What it is, it's an overreach of pursuit of egalitarianism. It's like you want so bad for there to be this equality and this justice that you overreach beyond what is logical, beyond what is ethical, beyond what is moral, and you make these essentially these demands, and you almost warp your mind around this reality. And it's like, I mean, it's beyond preposterous.
I don't think that's what I'm doing at all. Like all I'm doing is
Gio,
like I'm
Nico,
showing just looking at the scientific standard and how evidence works.
Can I
that
ask a
you
question
could,
real quick?
there's no way that you could actually prove your innocence with 100% certainty. I know you lowered to 99.9, but still, that is just not the nature of science.
Hey. Nico, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Sorry.
I want to pause both of you. Let me just ask this question because I think it could provide clarification on both sides. And I know it seems like an off-topic, but it's not, I promise. And it's not a trap.
Sure.
Nico, do you think there are any sports, competitively speaking, in which both natural-born biological males and females could compete against each other at a competitive professional level? Any sport at all? And I mean, like, I include things in the Olympics such as like ice skating, throwing darts, billiards, table tennis, pool, golf, name it. Do you think any sport exists in which men, biologically speaking men, and biologically speaking women could compete against each other in a competitive professional fashion?
I'll answer that question on two fronts. So first front is, do I know of any sports? And that is a hard no. I do not know of a single sport on the face of this planet. And the second question, or the second front that I'll answer it on is, in my opinion, do I think such a sport exists? And that as well is going to be an absolute no, hard no.
Could you provide me any example in which a man would have a competitive advantage in the game of darts? It is played at professional levels. The distance between the target and the thrower is the same no matter what. And you don't really have to throw it all that hard. Honestly, a toddler could get it to the board. Can you give me a specific advantage due to biological sex that darts a male would have over a female or vice versa?
Well, first and foremost, I'll say that I did not consider darts a sport.
Okay.
I'm not saying that.
How about billiards or pool, whatever you want to call it? Billiards. Does that?
Yep.
How about that? I mean, it's played professionally. People get paid to do it all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. But again, that as well, I don't consider to be a sport just because.
Yeah, you're probably talking about like more physical sports. Right.
Yeah, I mean, like even something like table tennis.
Let me just be very clear with So I'm not saying that, hey, billiards is not a sport and darts is not a sport. I'm not stating that. I'm stating that when I'm referring to sports, I was not speaking to sports like that. I'm speaking to sports that require how do I word this? The more physical physical exertion is an advantage. So
yeah, I get what you're saying. Like most like you're more like your outdoor sports, not your sports that could be played, inside of a bar.
Well, not necessarily all outdoor. So similar to that, but for example, I'll give you one that's kind of in between the two, and that's table tennis. That I think men have a distinct advantage over women because there is a requisite to speed and power. Any sport that requires that the person with more speed and power typically will excel, then I believe I'm referring to those sports alone. With darts are not, as far as I know, darts are not a speed and power sport, and neither is billiards. It's not about speed and power. Now you have to use some speed and some power and some force on the stick, and same thing with darts. You have to actually be able to pick up the darts and throw it, but for someone who bench presses 135 pounds versus someone who bench presses 535 pounds, there's not going to be any sort of advantage with darts because it only takes the strength to lift, a pen to throw a dart. Do you understand what I mean by that?
Sure. So the reason I brought the question up is because I wanted to make something pretty abundantly clear, hopefully, to both of you, because it seems that you're almost talking beside each other, getting to the point where I'm not even in the conversation. And that's fine. I'm all for you two having such a lively debate. But what I wanted to bring up is that in cases of physicality, there are undoubted advantages for people that are like you, who said you were 6'5" plus and 290 pounds. You're going to have an advantage over a lot of the people I work with who are biologically born male and they're 110 pounds. But you wouldn't say like they have a unfair disadvantage to you in football. I mean, of course they do.
Well,
so like the point is like if you're dividing it strictly on a, well, I mean, like my point is you're drawing the line at pure physical biological sex. And I'm saying that like the reason we have things like weightlifting and like the boxing gloves in the background is because even amongst biologically born male competitors, the examples of weight class have been taken into effect. So we're saying that if the only factor you're looking at is biological sex when considering the sport, perhaps you're going to miss something like in the cases of boxing or wrestling, in which there's also things like weight class considered. Because if I got one of my best buddies to box you, he's about 5'1" and weighs about 110 pounds. He would die. And I mean that in a very literal sense, because one punch from you would probably kill him. So there's a reason you're in a different weight class there.
So what's your point with that?
My point is that if he fought a 150-pound female that was 5'8", he'd probably still lose. But you see what I'm saying? Like, there's obviously more differences than biological sex that are going into and should go into the decision factors when deciding on professional sports. If the only thing you're considering is the biological sex or length of hormone therapy or testosterone levels, the clear examples of things like Leah Thomas and Caster Semenya are factored out, and they're often make bad decisions. So there are more things that people need to consider. That's my point.
I think the point you're making is slightly it's off. It's not necessarily relevant to what's being discussed here. Let me explain. Because when I say it's not that we're solely considering biological sex when
you said, and I quote, sport. That you would only accept that transgender in sports when 100% scientific was proven that they did not have a biological sexual advantage. So
may I finish what I was stating? Because I'm going to clarify exactly what you just said. So I am not referring solely to biological sex as it relates to how we ought to analyze sports. I am solely referring to biological sex as it relates to how we ought to analyze crossover in sports. Not just sports. I'm a big fan of boxing, and I do not think that it is... Now, if you have... I do not believe that it is, for lack of better phrase, a good idea to pit a heavyweight boxer against a middleweight or a featherweight. I don't think that's a good idea at all, and I don't support that at all. And I'm glad that boxing, the boxing federation, the powers that be that regulate boxing, that they don't allow it. Now, they do allow two people to say, hey, you want to fight? Sure, I want to fight. You want to fight? Okay, let's fight. And two people of different weight classes can agree to do so, but typically it's going to be for an exhibition match. And we saw that recently with Logan Paul versus Floyd Mayweather, Logan Paul being, I believe, 2 weight classes heavier than Floyd Mayweather. But that's just an exhibition. That's just two guys agreeing to throw punches at each other and invite people to pay tickets to watch, right? That's just freedom. You can do that. But when it's talked about boxing that goes on your record, having a chance to win a belt, crossing into two people of 2 separate weight classes is not allowed, and that I support. So again, when I'm saying exclusively biological sex, I am referring to whether or not we should allow crossover. And by crossover, I mean someone who is not born a biological woman to compete in sports against biological women. So I'm completely consistent with that.
Can I ask you a question? I want to say, what if there was a study?
But before you do, I'd like, And sorry, so I forget what's your name again?
I go by Fantastic Facade. It's good. You can call me whatever. Just
Eh,
the other guy.
Oh,
Um,
okay, yeah.
I,
So I'd like you to respond to what I said. You kind
yeah,
of see what I mean. That
I can
I
I
don't
can do
believe
that
I've
with just a simple
contradicted
question.
myself at
What if
all.
there is a biologically born female with ample muscle mass density and bone density that would be equivocal to a, let's just say, featherweight boxer? Would you be okay with her fighting a biologically male featherweight boxer? If your answer is still
If they both
no, then I don't understand the point you're trying to make, because there's
no, wait, my answer is not no in that regard. It's not no. So, and again, this is not.
do
I
you
want to be
think that the
very
male
clear.
in that
So,
situation would have an undoubted biological, physical, sexual advantage than a
so
female
not
in the same weight class with
visual
similar
male, but
muscle density and bone structure?
so not that necessarily that individual male, but men at large versus women at large.
Right,
100%.
just like
There's an
just
advantage.
like a heavyweight boxer would have an extreme advantage over someone in the featherweight class, because one
Correct.
punch would probably knock their clock off, right? So what I'm
Correct.
saying is, it's not all about physical, like the physical sex and the biological sex someone is born as. There are other factors
Yes,
that
when you're
have to come
talking
into
about
play.
crossover, yes, it is. What do you?
No, I just gave you
regarding
I
crossover.
just gave you an example. What if a female boxer came into a boxing match and said, "Okay, I have the same weight class as this person, and my muscle mass and density and bone mass are equivalent to this featherweight male, biologically male born boxer." You said
Right.
you wouldn't see a problem with those two fighting, and there wouldn't be a
Correct.
strategic advantage for the male or female in that case.
Well, no, not necessarily.
So I want to jump in. So in this scenario, like, I mean, there actually might be an advantage. Like, just because, like, even if they're let's say they have the exact same BMI, which is unlikely if it's a female, because she's gonna have breasts, right, and extra layer of fat like all over her body anyway. But
Right.
just because of the testosterone, which is going to be promoting hemoglobin, which is pushing more oxygen to their muscles, the male may have an advantage due to that. I mean, there's some other
The
factors
male
in there
will
as well.
likely have an advantage.
But so what if this? What if you had a scenario whereas there was a scientific study that showed that early transitioning trans women had hemoglobin levels and testosterone levels equal to that of cis women, which is what determines ultimately your strength, speed, explosive power, all of that. What if there was a study that showed that?
What are you asking more specifically?
Yeah, so I'm asking, so like, what if there was a study that showed that hemoglobin and testosterone levels in trans women were equal to that as cis women?
Well, I'll say that I think those two things are relevant, but I don't know that just because testosterone and what was it you said, hemoglobin, and what was the other one?
Testosterone. It's what
Yeah.
your testosterone. That's largely going to be determining like your muscle mass. Hemoglobin that takes oxygen
Certainly.
from your blood to the muscles. It's what makes it. It's going to allow you to run farther and last longer.
Yeah. So if there was a study that showed that, generally speaking, levels between biologically born women and biologically born men who transitioned at a young age, while I think that's important, I would not rely solely on those two. Again, what it has to come down to, now, those may be indicators of an advantage or lack thereof, but that's not going to be sufficient. You have to prove that there's essentially no advantage. So I understand that those are relevant in,
Bigger, you got really low. You got really low. I can barely hear you. Can you hear him?
Oh, really?
Okay,
can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can still hear him.
Okay, go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, so yes. So although I think those are important, I'm not just going to say, okay, the testosterone and the hemoglobin, okay, those are about equal. So, hey, we're good to go. No, it has to be proven, essentially proven without a doubt.
But those where the advantages lie. That's why they
Well,
test those
again,
specific things. Like it
but
wouldn't make sense to test something like hair density or something like that, like it or eye color. Like you test the things that drive the performance, and that's what drives those. That's what's going to determine muscle mass, endurance, explosive power, all of those things, as well as bone density. That's what I'm saying. And those are those are when it comes in like.
Fine.
Go ahead.
That's fine, but that's not the standard. The standard is not the measurability of those things. The standard is whether or not there is an athletic, physical advantage or not. So those two things you can measure, and that's probably important if you're going to be trying to prove this point. However, it doesn't stop there. The standard is no athletic advantage. It's got to be the standard.
Well, so again,
you understand?
Said
like,
no
even if
advantage,
even if you find an advantage, right? So I talked about the epistemic problems of saying there's no advantages, right? Because that's not what science does. It could just say there is no we don't see an advantage. That's the best it could do. But let's say even if there is an advantage, that's not. There's no guarantee that that's tied to their biological sex. That's another thing that you couldn't even. It's just beyond the capabilities of science.
I really don't, man.
Yeah, I mean, I think what he's pointing out and what you may, I don't know. I just wanted to give my 2 cents because sometimes it helps. Is that it's clear sometimes that when in science we're not looking for ways to disprove something. However, if we're not seeing a pattern of something happening, like based off of hemoglobin and testosterone levels, that typically is what provides biologically born males advantages to females in certain sporting competitions.
If anything involving strength or speed, those are your driving factors.
If those are not found, then we say there are no advantages seen. Right, because those are the ones what we're looking for. If we started looking at other things and found that there was some really outlandish advantage due to other factors, we could also consider it. I think the whole point is that there's no way to definitively say in science that there's never going to be an advantage if you follow these steps. It's just not possible.
Yeah, because you could just say there's some advantage that we just haven't seen yet. We just overlooked something. What is it? We don't know. Like there's good ways, and you couldn't even prove otherwise.
My point is there are good ways to ensure that there is meaningful competition by maintaining the things like testosterone levels and hemoglobin levels, and when observing amongst people that are in transition or transition during the time of puberty, that it seems to be equivocal to that of the cisgendered sex that they are identifying as. So that's the pattern that we have seen and the studies that we are showing, although they're not in professional athletes because there are so few transgender professional athletes that the study hasn't been performed at any conclusive level. But for the information that we do have, that is what is showing. Trying to disprove there's any physical advantage is kind of like saying disprove that the color blurple doesn't exist. Like you just don't do that. You say, well, of all the colors we've studied, none of them say blurple.
Well, like I said earlier, and I'll say here again, and I will accept the scientific study that concludes that there is more than likely. I'll take that. I will take that it's highly unlikely that this person who transitioned has any sort of physical advantage over a natural born female. I will take that.
I will gladly take that. But and you guys keep saying studies are showing or studies are pointing to. I want to be clear. We do not have conclusive studies that conclude that. We absolutely do not. And we do not have examples of young girls who have, or excuse me, young boys who have transitioned to female and essentially continued their life and competed at the high school or collegiate or professional level, and essentially whether they were successful or unsuccessful, we don't have those examples. So it's a very hypothetical proposition, but even that, I still give it to you. I will give you that proposition, but it's got to be scientifically proven. If you can find me that, I will jump on board because why wouldn't I?
As far as specifically about transgender athletes, no, like there aren't studies for those. But as far as the hemoglobin and testosterone levels, early stage transition, we do have studies. Like I'm looking at them. Like I was
But
using.
do you understand why the standard cannot just stop at hormones testosterone and hemoglobin? That's
Well,
not the standard.
I mean, sure. Like there could be other things that I mean, we haven't, like, humans hasn't reached the pinnacle of knowledge. There may be other things that could also help increase the performance of men over women, as far as strength and speed is concerned. But as far as we know, if you look at those two things, it just the best standard that we have right now is looking at the testosterone, which is pushing hemoglobin, right? And far as we can see, with those scientific studies, they're showing that there is no advantage, not for early transition. Like, and this wouldn't necessarily apply to Leah Thomas, which is who we were discussing on Facebook.
Sure.
This wouldn't apply to her.
Sure.
But for early stage transition, that's what the studies are showing specifically for that.
Again, this is so I just can't even believe. I really can't even believe you guys. Lord, okay. Boy, I tell you. So even still, even if that is what the science is pointing to, it's like you can't just say, okay, the science is pointing to cisgendered women and trans women, or I should say girls, who undergo the transition at a young age. Science is pointing to them having the same or comparable levels of testosterone, hemoglobin, what have you, and then say, okay, therefore, based on that, athletics, good to go. Have at it, people. No, you still have to study that specifically. Because as you just stated, there's not examples of and studies for trans athletes. Well, if you're trying to make a change, if you're trying to make something acceptable within the realm of athletics and sports, that's where you have to prove it. Because that's where it's relevant. Because otherwise, what difference does it make?
We should make those decisions on the best available information. If right now what's showing is that there's no difference for early puberty transition, then we should start letting them compete. If later on down the road we find out, oh, it was actually this other thing that gives them this huge advantage that has nothing to do with that, I'm fine with that, and we can start separating them along those lines again. What I'm saying is, we should do is make do on the best available information. But what you're saying, it seems like what you want to do is hold out until science does the epistemically impossible. That is prove a negative, and that is not what science does. We can't prove negatives. We cannot prove there is no advantage. The best we can do is look and say we don't see an advantage.
And again, I gave you that. I gave you that. If that's what the science points to, I'll give you that. But again, man, if we can maybe diverge from specifically talking about what we've been talking about, let me just get a little bit of kind of your viewpoints, and or again, if you have time, you can end this whenever you need to. But maybe let me just get understanding of, because obviously this conversation started over this swimmer who won, I believe, the national championship at her level. And so
500-meter freestyle.
So do you view that her situation as problematic in any way?
I mean, me
I'm sorry, you got really low. I didn't understand what he said. Say it one more time, Nico.
Oh, I said, do you view the situation with this Leah Thomas is her name or what have you? Do you believe that situation is problematic in any way?
Yes, I definitely think that's problematic. For one, she started to transition too early. This wouldn't apply to the studies I was talking about. And also, they don't even check testosterone levels. Or for the NCAA, the only thing they require is a year of therapy. And a lot of studies are showing a year just isn't enough. Even a lot of studies are showing that even 36 months, which is 3 years, isn't enough. There's still a advantage for trans women and there are for cis women. Yeah, so yes, with Leah Thomas, I do see that.
Yeah, it's undoubtedly the reason we have up on the screen that there's a difference between standards and sporting organizations, and that's something we definitely want to bring up and consider when discussing these points, because as Gio was just pointing out, in the NCAA, it's 1 year of hormone therapy, but in the Olympics, that's a different story altogether. And there's even difference amongst
that's not enough.
That same event, much less like different levels of the sporting. So like the Olympics versus NCAA, but also like swimming versus like football.
Yeah, and especially it's not even enough for like a regular man. It especially wouldn't be enough like someone like you, like an NFL player. Like your testosterone levels, I'm sure it's going to be higher than even average. A year of hormone therapy is not going to put you in a comparable position to play in like the lingerie league, for example. You know, that's not gonna that wouldn't fly. So like I agree with you on Leah Thomas. I do think that's problematic. The standard just wasn't strict enough.
Gotcha. Okay, I'm glad we're on the same page there.
And I think what both of you are saying, or what at least what Gio is saying and trying to get to the point of, is that by constantly honing and kind of sharpening where we draw the line and draw the edge by studying professional athletes and like as they compete, if it turns out there is this obvious advantage that we find by these studies, then that's something where we can now have a firmer line in the sand. But I think what you're looking for is, let's stop all trans athletes from competing in professional sports until we can definitively say these are the exact factors that lead to it, and this is how we'll stop that from being an advantage. I think what the other way is, we're saying perhaps let's let them compete knowing if there is an advantage that we're doing what we can to keep that from happening. And if we miss something, like for instance, if it is not indeed hemoglobin and testosterone, it's some other factor, we'll continue examining these contenders, and as we discover that it is an additional factor, we'll recognize that as a competitive advantage, and then the line can be drawn again.
Okay, so I see what you're saying there. I would say that I definitely disagree with that approach, because with that approach, you're saying, hey, we don't have enough evidence, but we'll go ahead and allow it, and if more evidence pops up in the future, hey, we'll just change it. And that's, I mean,
guilty to proven innocent.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like in competitive sports now. Like, until we discover something that happens.
You're making a step. You're taking an action step, and then saying, oh, by the way, this hasn't been proven to be bad yet. But so we're just gonna. It's like you can't take the step of action first, and then say, well, we're just gonna go with this step of action until it's proven that this step of action ought not be. It's like, hey, we're just going to go ahead and throw you in prison for life. And hey, if we find more evidence that says you didn't do it, hey, you can come back out of jail. That is not how it works. You're saying
that's exactly what you're doing. That's what we're saying. Like we shouldn't do. We're saying we're arguing in favor, of liberty and privilege. Hey, we're saying, hey, until it's shown that there's an advantage, you should be free to compete.
No, You're saying to let these athletes go ahead and compete. That is a step of action that doesn't have enough evidence to prove that that is not problematic. That's
but
an
you're trying to
action
prove a
step.
negative
They
there.
allow this to be.
Yeah, but the evidence would be on the people saying there is an advantage, because there are studies done specifically non-athletes who transition early, and they can't find an advantage from most of the studies of what I'm seeing. So if you're saying, hey, this person ought not to compete, then it's on those people to give the reason. Hey, they shouldn't compete because of such and such. What you're saying is
So
they shouldn't compete because they haven't proven that they don't have an advantage. Like the burden of proof is on the people making the claim.
No,
Because
no.
I'm not saying
No,
that there
that's
is
not
no advantage. That's
the
not what I'm
burden.
saying.
No,
I'm
you have
saying
this
that we
backwards.
have not
You got
found
this
an
back.
advantage for this small group of trans men. I'm sorry, trans women.
No, sir, you got this backwards, man. Because if I'm a male, if I'm competing against other males, like I don't like to compete against other males. This is default. This is essentially what we know historically, Olympic sports globally, to be fair as far as we can see it. For men to compete against men, for heavyweights to box against heavyweights, for women to compete against women, for weight divisions among women to be separate. For, this is what, as far as we can tell, what we see to be fair. So then to allow people who are born male to compete against people who are born female, that is a deviation from what we currently know to be fact, which is that men have advantages over women. So in order to allow that deviation, it is ethical to first, prior to allowing that deviation, you have to prove that there is fairness, that there is no advantage. And so you don't allow them to compete and then say, hey, if something pops up later that says that indeed these people do have an advantage, hey, we'll just go ahead and draw the line elsewhere and take them out of sports. But hey, why don't you go ahead and keep all your gold medals that you acquired over the last 12 years?
Do you
That's so problematic.
You play football, yeah? Football, like American football, yeah?
Correct.
Okay, so like you guys use electronic systems in your headsets to communicate?
Some players do,
Okay.
specifically the quarterback.
Okay, cool. So let's just say hypothetically, I was able to hack into that system and I could hear the entire conversation between the coach and the quarterback. Would you say that's an unfair advantage?
Would I say the fact that you can hear?
Yeah.
it?
Yeah.
And who are you? Are you like an opposing team?
Yeah, let's say I'm working for the opposing team. I got hired for the opposing team specifically to hack the headsets.
Sure.
Okay, so
Yes.
my thing is, I bet you right now there's not a what if my headset gets hacked rule in the NFL.
What if your headset gets what now?
Hacked. Like, what if that exact situation happens? Like, A,
Then-
you'd have to prove that your headset was hacked, and then B, you'd have to prove that it was me on behalf of the other team that was hacking it, right? What I'm saying
of
is,
course.
the positive claim here is that I hacked your headset, right? You can't say like when addressing issues like the burden of proof, it is a positive claim that must be stated, and that is where the burden of proof comes from. Your positive claim is that we must prove that no advantage exists. That is not a positive claim. You must claim that an advantage exists, and here's my proof for it. Or another positive claim would be no advantage exists, and here's every statement ever that proves that there's no advantage. You can't say that my positive claim is that nothing exists. We say we can't see any advantage, and until you can prove otherwise, there is no advantage. Now, if you can't see the fact that I'm hacking your headset, is there an advantage? Yes. Until it's proven, there's really nothing you can do about it. right?
But
So
as
that's
we
the burden of
discussed it-
proof lies on you to prove that I've hacked your headset.
Well, that's well. Oh my goodness. So
That's the way our
On
entire
one second,
justice system works.
I like to go ahead and give like Nico the last word on this because I'm gonna have to get ready to go because
Okay,
I
that's
gotta
fine. You can respond, or
I
if you'd
gotta
like to just say whatever
feed
you'd like
the
to say,
kid.
you're more than welcome to do so.
okay, yeah, gotcha. I'll just say regarding this specific situation, the burden of proof would be on that team who's getting hacked. Yes, the burden of proof is on them to get some sort of action taken as far as a conviction or as far as
You went out.
Yeah,
I'm not hearing him. Are you hearing him, Facade?
No, he disappeared on me too. He went quiet.
there's like weird sound coming from
Okay,
that.
go ahead.
Oh,
Go
there it
ahead.
is.
But anyhow,
I
what
can
I'm
hear.
saying was that, yeah, the situation with the football teams and the helmet getting hacked, yes, if you want action taken against that cheating team to stop listening in on the headset, yes, you would essentially have to prove that it is happening. However, if we're sitting at a table discussing the ethics of that, we don't have to. We know that the headset and the communication between the coach and his player is supposed to be exclusive between them. And we can say, hey, look, if someone is indeed hacking, it is a unfair advantage, it is cheating, and it ought to be stopped. So same thing as it relates to sports. When we sit here and discuss it, we can discuss the ethics of it and clearly state that if indeed this is occurring and there's an advantage, that it ought to be stopped. And again, the default advantage is because we're using a lot of these terms like cisgender, biological male. Okay, look, there's a term for people who are born with penises. It's called male. There's a term for people who are born with vaginas. It's called female. We're talking about that group. So if you're born with a penis, it doesn't matter what you identify as. If you're born with a penis, we already know, verifiably so, that you have advantages over people as far as athletically. You have advantages over people who are not born with penises. We know that. So then to allow a penis person to compete against a non-penis person, you have to prove that there is zero advantage. And that's why I say the burden of proof lies on that pursuit of the deviation. And that's my final statement.
All right, fair enough.
Well, hey, Nico, I really appreciate you calling in, man. I remember back in college, I think we were in communications class together, man. You were always a very lively, charismatic, and well-reasoned debater. I knew it would be great to have you on the show. So I really appreciate you calling in. Is there anything that you wanted to plug?
Yeah,
I know you run a YouTube page.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. My YouTube page is Nico Nice. You can find me on YouTube. I have not been posting consistently. However, I will be very soon. So if you want to follow me and get my opinion on all sorts of topics like this, like anything that has to do with social justice, then you can find me on YouTube at Nico Nice or Instagram at Nico Nice as well. Thank you all for listening, for whoever is listening, and I appreciate you fellas for having me on.
Absolutely, thank you. We'll find your YouTube and your Instagram, and I'll post them in the link section for our YouTube video as well as on our Facebook page.
Yeah, we'll plug it for you, brother.
Man.
Thank you,
brother.
Thank you, Nico. Have a good day, man. All right, we're going to go ahead and wrap up the show. We are well past our due date and time, but thank you guys so much for listening. A huge thanks to Nico for giving us a call in, and we had a few comments on YouTube. Looks like just some emojis, but Gio does have to go and feed his kid, and I have to take care of some business as well. So if you guys appreciated it, please give us a like, give us a comment, let us know what you want us to talk about next time. Thank you guys so much for watching. This has been Now That's Debatable.